Hello, 5th grade. So, we are going to be reading chapters 9 and 10 of The Monsters of Morley Manor. The last time we read, it was quite interesting. So, we found out that our wizard, Wentar, his name was not actually Wentar. Wentar was the name of his species. And we found out that he was actually more of an alien. And that when Martin had disappeared and come back a lot different than he was before, we found out that he was actually cloned and his clone was sent back. So Martin stayed captured the whole time by these people called the Flinduvians. And then while we were in the Mad Scientist lab, the Flinduvians started to come and they were trying to get our main characters. And we found out the reason was because the Flinduvians want to come and take over Earth. So they were trying to use the Martin clone to try and find more out about Earth. So to try and escape the Flinduvians, they went through the Starry Door and it took them to this new place. And we're not exactly sure where We weren't exactly sure where this was, but then Ludmilla told us that they were in Zentrazana, which is the same place that one crystal came from that was able to make the monsters big and small. It's the one that they were using as the power source when Anthony had to help Gaspar make the monsters big again. So now they're in Zentazarna. They're now in Zentazarna, and there is something coming up out of the water at our characters, and Sarah grabbed my arm. "What the heck is that?" she cried. So we're going to start with chapter 9, which is called Water Guys. The creature that stood dripping at the edge of the water was about 4 feet high. Even though it had arms and walked upright, it looked sort of like a cross between a frog and a fish. A spiny crest ran from its head to its butt. Huge, goggling eyes were set above a mouth so wide that I figured if the thing yawned, the top of its head would fall off. It had gills, but no scales. Its skin, which glistened in the sunlight, looked like mottled purple leather with a light coating of slime. I probably should have been more scared than I was. Maybe what kept me from totally wigging out is the fact that I like frogs so much. We have a lot of them in Owl's Roost, and I like to catch them and hypnotize them. It's a trick I learned from a library book. If you turn a frog upside down and slowly rub your fingertip from its throat down along its belly over and over again, pretty soon it'll get totally calm and just lie there in your hand, unable to move. It's really cool, but you have to be very gentle when you do it. The water guy held up a webbed hand, then made a series of croaks that sounded like a whole frog orchestra. Everything from the tiny trills of spring peepers to something like a rumble of a bullfrog, only much, much deeper. The Wentar put his hands on the sides of his own neck for a moment, then made a series of similar sounds. Given the fact that I can barely pass my French tests, I found this very impressive. The water guy responded with another froggy chorus. "What did he say?" asked Gaspar. "His name is Chug Rug Lala Opsa Lala Ruggum Bup Bup," replied the Wentar, the words coming from deep in his throat. "But you can call him Chuck." "That's a relief," muttered Albert. The Wentar glared at him. "Chuck welcomes us, as long as we guarantee that we come in peace." "A welcome is all very nice," said Gaspar impatiently. "The question is, will he help this band of poor lost wanderers?" "That is what I'm trying to figure out," snapped the Wentar. "Perhaps if you stopped interrupting me, I would be able to get an answer." Gaspar clamped his mouth shut and demonstrated what a lizard looks like when he feels both embarrassed and angry. The Wentar and the water guy talked for another minute or so, sounding like a chorus of swamp creatures on a warm spring night. Finally, the Wentar turned to the rest of us and said, "Lie on your backs." Gaspar looked suspicious. "For what reason?" The Wentar sighed. "I have to do something, and it'll be easier if you are all lying down, preferably in a circle, with your heads at the center." Gaspar tightened his jaws, then nodded twice, once at the Wentar and once at the rest of us, indicating that we should do as he said. It took a while. Albert couldn't get comfortable because of his hump. And Bob whined and growled, causing Gaspar to admit that they had never managed to train him very well. For me, the worst of it was the snakes on Melisandre's head, which wouldn't hold still. They had just settled into my spot when one of them came slithering across my neck, causing me to scream and leap to my feet. "What now?" asked the Wentar angrily. "Snake!" I grasped, clutching at my neck. It was crawling all over me. Melisandre looked offended, and her snakes all hissed. "He wasn't going to hurt you. He was just checking you out." Gaspar's tongue, long as a snake itself, flicked in and out of his mouth. "Lay back down," he ordered. "Melisandre, keep the boys under control." She glared at him, but nodded. "Glad it wasn't me," whispered Sarah when I was on my back again. "I wish it had been," I said. That was only partly true. I actually kind of like snakes. Sarah hates them. And if one had crawled over her neck, it might have taken us hours for her to get settled down again. The Wentar began to look around us, muttering in a low voice. He took something from a leather pouch at his side and sprinkled it all over our heads. The chug-rug-lala-opsa-lala-rugum-bup-bup splashed water on us. "Hold still," ordered the Wentar when we started to sit up, and he said it so sharply that even Bob obeyed. Then he began to sing in a low voice, gesturing all over us as he did. I felt a weird tingle creep across my skin. After about 5 minutes, the Wentar said, "Now you can sit up." "What was that all about?" I muttered. Though I was speaking to myself, Chuck answered me. "We were arranging things so you could communicate with us more easily." Actually, what he said was a whole series of croaks and peeps, but I understood them perfectly. "How did that happen?" asked Sarah. She sounded astonished as I felt. She also sounded just like Chuck. I don't mean she had his voice, just that the sounds she was making were in his language. I stared at her in amazement. "We cast a spell on you, of course," said the Wentar. I had always figured aliens would be super scientific. I was having a hard time getting used to the idea of them as magic users. "Follow me," said the water guy, heading for the edge of the lake. "I want you to meet my mother." "She doesn't mind having strangers just drop by?" I asked nervously. "Does she live underwater?" asked Sarah, sounding even more nervous. "Don't worry," Chuck said. "You'll be able to breathe. We took care of that, too." He squatted, then sprang forward, not even looking to see if we were going to follow him. The jump carried him a good 30 feet straight out. He landed with a large splash, then disappeared beneath the surface. The Wentar waded in after him. Bob followed close at his heels, but I suspect that he was mostly because he liked the water. Though he was still in his semi-human form, he barked exuberantly as he bounded through the rippling waves. Suddenly, he plunged in over his head, and as if he had gone just past a drop-off. He came up once, splashing and spluttering, then disappeared again. This time, he didn't come back up. "Must be the breathing thing works," said Sarah. "Either that or something ate him," replied Albert. "Don't be ridiculous," snapped Gaspar. Squaring his shoulders, he waded into the water after Bob, the Wentar, and Chuck. "Come along, Albert," he said, without looking back. "Destiny awaits." "Whatever you say, boss," said Albert. He glanced back at me and Sarah, rolled his eyes, spread his hands in a what can you do kind of gesture, then turned and followed Gaspar into the water. That left Ludmilla, Melisandre, Sarah, and me standing on the shore. "What about my hair?" murmured Melisandre. It wasn't the kind of girl question it sounds like, since her snakes were twisting and writhing around her head in great alarm. Even so, it did make me realize that it was just me and the girls on the beach. So I stepped in. "Anthony, wait!" cried Sarah. She came splashing after me. The water was cold and had an odd, lemony smell. The smell was actually kind of pleasant. It was just weird. It was also weird to go in with my clothes on, though the legs of my jeans were already damp from the walk to Morley Manor. Now they clung tightly to my skin, feeling cold and heavy. I was glad I hadn't put anything important in my pockets before we left home that night. As we moved deeper into the lake, I heard Melisandre and Ludmilla wade in behind us, grumbling and hissing as they did. I figured they were even unhappier about getting their clothes wet than I was, but I didn't look back. I was busy peering into the water around me, worrying about everything from mud-eating plants to giant slime fish to living mud. Given the creatures we had already met, who knew what sorts of things might live in the lakes of this planet? Suddenly, Gaspar stuck his head above the surface. Water streamed off his long snout. "For heaven's sake," he shouted, "hurry up!" That was a good sign. The fact that we had not seen any of the others who had gone under had me worried. Turning to Sarah, I said, "Ready?" She nodded. Joining hands, we waded forward. Since she was shorter, her head went under first. I stood and watched. Okay, I know that makes me sound really rotten, but I figured if there was a problem, it would be easier for me to haul her out than vice versa. A second later, she stuck her head up and called, "Hurry, Anthony, this is really neat." Then I was annoyed because I hadn't gone under first. I plunged in after her. I tried holding my breath, but I quickly realized that couldn't last for long. Besides, the point was to breathe the water. Cautiously, very cautiously, I let some of it trickle in through my nose. Utterly cool. Instead of choking and burning, the water felt good in my lungs. Feeling bolder, I drew in a deep breath, filling my lungs with lemony water. It was heavy in my chest, but not uncomfortable. I looked around. The Wentar spell must have done something to our eyes as well as our lungs, because I could see perfectly. Strange, fish-like creatures swam all around us. Some of them were transparent, like ghost fish. Others had big, googling eyes, or fins that trailed behind them like ribbons. Ahead of us, weird plants stretched towards the surface, bending back and forth like ghostly, grasping hands. A variety of brilliantly colored flowers, some as small as thimbles, some as big as dinner plates, bloomed on the bottom. Boy, I bet Mom and Dad would love some of those for the shop, he thought. Then I spotted Gaspar. He looked impatient. "Come on," I said to Sarah, "we better hurry." I half expected the words to come out in little bubbles. Duh, you have to have air to make bubbles, and we weren't breathing air anymore. So the words just came out as sound, made odd by the fact that they were traveling through water rather than air. I glanced over my shoulder. The lake bed sloped up behind us. Ludmilla and Melisande were completely underwater now, too, and Melisand's snakes were writhing wildly about her head. I hoped the snakes were all right. I thought about going back to check, but I figured Melisande would know if anything was wrong. Even as I watched, they began to settle down. Since Melisande didn't turn and head for the surface, I figured they were relaxing, not drowning. I glanced up. The sun catching on the water that rippled overhead made the surface look like some kind of silvery ceiling with a pattern that changed from moment to moment. I tapped Sarah's shoulder and pointed for her to look. She smiled, then said happily, "This is the weirdest, coolest thing that's ever happened to us, Anthony." I didn't know if she meant breathing underwater or everything that had gone on since we first put Albert in the sink. Either way, she was right. Melisande and Ludmilla had caught up with us by that time. "We'd better keep moving," said Ludmilla. We started out again. The lake bed was getting kind of mucky, and some clinging weeds made it hard to walk, so we began to swim, which turned out to be a lot easier. Though we could breathe, the water was still wet, of course, so our hair was floating around our heads while our clothes were plastered to our bodies. Not that Melisandre's dress hadn't been pretty much plastered to her body already. Sarah caught me looking at her now and gave me an elbow in the ribs. As we swam deeper, I felt the pressure of the water begin to squeeze me. I wondered how far down we were going to go, and whether the Wentar spell would protect us from being squished by the water's great weight. I was gazing around, fascinated by the fish and the scenery, and not paying much attention to where we were heading, when suddenly Sarah cried out, "Holy mackerel!" At first, I thought she had seen a giant fish. Then I realized that the water guy had led us over a cliff. I was terrified when I saw that dark drop beneath us, but really it was no big deal. When you're already in the water, you're not going to fall or anything. As my terror began to ebb, I studied the strange landscape below us. Then I saw what Sarah had been shouting about. It wasn't the cliff after all. My heart began to pound again, and I wondered if we had been betrayed. Chapter 10. The Mother of All Frogs. Squatting in the center of that landscape, huge and astonishing, was a creature that looked somewhat like Chug Rug Lala Apsalala Rug Rug Bup Bup, with one major difference. This one was bigger than our house. When I first saw it, I thought it must be some kind of statue the water people had made, but seconds after we cleared the edge of the cliff, the enormous beast rolled its huge eyeballs in their socket, looked up at us, blinked twice, then opened its mouth. Out shot a tongue that had been at least 100 feet long. Like a green ribbon of death, the huge tongue wrapped around the Wentar and pulled him down into the creature's mouth, so fast that it was almost as if it hadn't happened. Panic exploded in my chest. Was this how I was going to die, swallowed by a giant frog on an alien planet? I looked around frantically for Sarah. She was only a few feet from me. "Come on," I cried. "Let's get out of here." I reached for her hand. Instinct, I guess, since it was actually a pretty silly thing to do. You can't swim very fast while you're holding hands. "Wait," ordered Chug-Rug Frogbutt. Right, like I was going to wait and see if he could feed us to his master, or whatever this thing was. But instinct again, I did turn my head back. As I did, I saw the Wentar crawl up from between the huge creature's lips. He climbed over the tip of its nose, and he had found a broad, flat spot where he could stand. Then he motioned for us to swim down and join him. "Should we do it?" whispered Sarah. Gaspar, who was floating nearby, said, "Once again we find the universe is stranger than we could have ever guessed. What new things shall we discover in this watery world? Forward, my family, forward." Which pretty much decided things for the Morleys, and for me. I figured if we tried to swim away, the monster would probably just nail us with its tongue anyway. So I nodded to Sarah. "Come on," I said. "Let's go." We swam deeper into the mysterious lake. "This is Queen Gunk alla Gunk Gunk Ipsum alla Ribbit," explained the Wentar, when all 7 of us had joined him and on the creature's snout. "She is the mother of all of us," added Chuck. "Speak for yourself," said Albert. "She is my official contact here," continued the Wentar, casting a dark glance at the little hunchback, "and our best chance for solving our problem. We need to go inside to talk to her." "Inside where?" I asked, looking around for a building and wondering how big it would have to be to hold this monster. "Her mouth," said the Wentar. "You have to be kidding," cried Ludmilla. Melisand's snakes twisted in alarm. "Humor is not one of my specialties," said the Wentar. "Now follow me. We are being treated with extreme kindness by an incredibly powerful being. It would not be wise to make a fuss about it." Stretching his arms, he swam off the frog monster's snout. Chuck went in with him, not even looking back. The rest of us stood for a moment, baffled and astonished, and terrified. Then Gaspar threw back his shoulders. "Family Morleskevich," he barked. "Assemble!" Quickly the monsters got in line. "We are the family Morleskevich," said Gaspar solemnly. "We do not flinch from danger. We do not shy away from the unknown. I say we go forward." "Forward!" cried the others. "Forward!" I cried, unable to help myself. Which is how Sarah and I ended up following the Morleys over the edge of the Queen's giant snout. We hadn't been off the frog monster's nose for more than 3 seconds when her great mouth opened and a rush of water pulled us into a dark space. A space that got even darker when the mouth closed again. This time I was sure we were done for, but a second later the Wentar did some of his magic and a dim light blossomed around us. The inside of the Queen's mouth was slightly smaller than my bedroom. Her tongue looked like a spongy shag rug. Sarah and I drifted down to stand on it, and the others were doing. I was relieved to find that it was not as sticky and slimy as I had feared. Toward the rear of her mouth, I saw a pair of bulges, which I finally realized must have been the back of her eyeballs. Beyond those bulges was the vast darkness of her throat, something I didn't intend to go anywhere near if I could help it. Suddenly, a deep thrum filled the air around us. It took me a moment to realize that the sounds were words, huge, booming words. Later, the Wentar explained that the Queen formed them by making a very tiny, for her, rumble in her throat. "Greetings to the Wentar of Ardis and his companions." Greetings to Queen Gunk alla Gunk Gunk Ipsum alla Ribbon, replied the Wentar, and our thanks to you for sheltering warmth of your mouth. May your poignancy ever increase and your children number in the millions. They do already, replied the Queen, sounding somewhat tired. 2,413,579, to be precise. Madam, you outdo yourself, said the Wentar admiringly. I undo myself, she replied. Now, let us get down to business, Wentar. I understand you are involved with a messy little planet called Earth. Indeed I am, replied Wentar. In fact, I have 7 of its people with me on this trip. I thought it was nice of him to count Bob as a person. That is highly unusual, is it not? Asked the Queen. The circumstances are unusual. I have become rather more involved in the affairs than I would like. I brought these young ones with me because they were being pursued. Ah, said the Queen, let me guess. The creatures of the red haze? Indeed, said the Wentar. He sounded a bit surprised. Creatures of the red haze? Asked Gaspar. He sounded as confused as the Wentar had sounded surprised. It is the name sometimes used for Flinduvians, said the Wentar. The red haze is a condition unique to their species, a kind of anger beyond anger that sometimes they slip into. The result can be remarkable. It is not a suitable condition for a civilized being, said the Queen. Agreed, said the Wentar, which is one reason I am monitoring them. I am almost certain that they are up to something. Do you have any idea what it is? That I cannot tell you, replied the Queen. Before the Wentar could express his disappointment, she added, However, perhaps one of my children will be able to give you some information. Suddenly I felt a vibration so powerful that at first I thought it was an earthquake. Sarah staggered against me. I saw the monsters all crouching, holding on to one another, trying to keep from tumbling over. Then I realized that whatever was going on couldn't be an earthquake, because we were standing on a giant tongue. Was our hostess trying to swallow us? What was that? Demanded Gaspar when the vibration stopped. I have sent out the water call, replied the Queen. I'm sorry you could not understand it. It will travel many miles, and if any of my children have knowledge of this thing, they will come to us. She hesitated, then added, They have no choice. Must be a mom thing, whispered Sarah. Before 5 minutes had passed, the Queen said, Ah, a response. I'm going to ask you to go outside for the discussion. I grow tired of trying not to swallow. Once she had said that, she couldn't open her mouth fast enough to suit me. Together, our little party swam out to meet the creature that had answered the Queen's call. He looked like Chuck enough like Chuck to be his brother, which of course he was. He says his name was Unk Lala Opsa Ribba Ribba Gibbet, then added, but you can call me Unk. We found a place to sit next to the Queen's left rear foot, which towered over us. Once we Earthlings had introduced ourselves, Unk said, Mother says, you want to know about the Flinduvians. That is correct, said the Wentar. Specifically, what is it that they want with Earth? Oh, I know nothing about that, said Unk quickly. I don't even believe him for a second. His eyes were desperate, haunted, as if he was lying not because he wanted to, but because he was afraid to tell the truth. Chuck saw it too. Speak truly, brother, he said fiercely. I demand it by the bond of our blood. Unk's eyes rolled back in his head. He shivered as if taken by a chill. I know nothing about it, he croaked. In your mother's name, I command you to speak, cried the Wentar. Unk began to tremble more violently. Suddenly, as if the fear was too much, he turned and started to swim away. Catch him, cried the Wentar. I was closest. I grabbed Unk's leg. The purple skin was slick beneath my fingers, the leg astonishingly strong. I clung to it with all my might. Though I couldn't stop him by myself, I slowed him enough for the others to grab him. He thrashed wildly. Suddenly, I had an idea. Turn him on his back, I shouted. Gaspar looked startled. No, cried Chuck, don't. The rest of us looked at him in surprise. It's not dignified, he said softly. I think the others might have ignored the strange request if not for that, but the tension in Chuck's voice made it clear that something about putting Unc on his back had power in it. So despite Chuck's protests, the monsters wrestled Unc to the silty floor of the lake. As they held him down, his arms and legs pinned out straight, I began to stroke his belly, working from the throat down, just as I had done 100 times with the frogs I caught in the swamp, at the edge of Grandma and Grandpa's farm. Of course, Unc was so big that I had to use my whole hand rather than just a fingertip, but the idea was the same. "You shouldn't do that," said Chuck softly, wringing his webbed hands together. "You shouldn't do that." Unc blinked his eyes, quickly at first, then more and more slowly. Soon his struggles grew less violent. Gradually his arms and legs relaxed. A moment later he was lying limp and still. "Now, is the Wentar of Artis content?" asked Chuck bitterly. I stepped back, feeling very clever. "That was really good, Anthony," whispered Sarah. "Shh," hissed Melisande Snakes. The Wentar bent over Unc. "Have you been in contact with the Flinduvians?" he whispered. Without opening his eyes, Unc nodded. The Wentar looked more sad than angry, placing his mouth close to the side of Unc's head. The water guy didn't really have an ear, just a brownish circle. He said urgently, "What do the Flinduvians want with Earth?" Unc made a sound deep in his throat. Then, as if the words were being dragged from someplace deep within him, he said, "They want Earth's ghosts." The Wentar blinked. The monsters made watery cries of astonishment. Sarah moved closer to me. Without intending to, I asked the next question. "What for?" Unc's answer, which came out almost as a sob, astonished us all. "They're going to use them for batteries." Interesting. So, turns out the Flinduvians want to try and use every ghost that is on Earth to try and get to use their energy as batteries, possibly to try and power something that we don't want them to power. So, that was chapters 9 and 10, and next time we will read chapter 11. Thanks, guys.